Welcome back, everyone, to another edition of the Prove Me Wrong podcast. I am your host, Pete Liebe. I have a really great show lined up for you all tonight. I am glad you decided to come along with me. My guest tonight is Dr. Patrick Moore, and we are going to revisit the climate change debate and the human impact on the environment. What is our role in this process? Are humans the primary determining factor, as some people would say? Or are we just a piece of the puzzle? And there are a lot of factors there that, we have to take into account. Dr. Moore is an absolute fixture in the climate change debate and has been a leader in the international environmental field for over 40 years. He is a founding member of Greenpeace and has served for 9 years as president of Greenpeace Canada and 7 years as director of Greenpeace International. After leaving Greenpeace in 1986, Dr. Moore has remained highly involved in the environmental movement, speaking frequently at universities, community meetings, and conferences, television appearances, and radio about sensible solutions to our climate, the environmental, economic, and social considerations, which are all extremely important. Dr. Moore has issues with the models used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the Ipcc, as we're going to refer to it for the remainder of the discussion, and the projections being made for our climate based on those models. Just type Dr. Moore's name into YouTube and you'll see, dozens of videos of Dr. Moore discussing the topic in more detail. Dr. Moore is also the author of the book Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, which you can purchase on Amazon, and you can also find more information on his website, ecosense.me. So let me welcome Dr. Moore to the Prove Me Wrong podcast. Welcome.
Thank you, Pete. It's nice to be with you.
Thank you so much. I have a lot to discuss tonight, but I wanted to take just a moment and take some baby steps first, if that's okay. And can you give the audience a little bit more history about you within the environmental movement, how you got started with Greenpeace initially, and ultimately what led you to become still so involved in the climate change discussion?
Well, Pete, I grew up in the late 1940s on a floating village, a tiny floating village on an inlet on the north end of Vancouver Island with no road to it. Everything was by boat. And that was even before float planes started coming in here. So I grew up in total nature in the west coast rainforest of northern Vancouver Island with bears and deer and salmon and cougars and wolves and all the wildlife you ever wanted around you. And I developed an innate love of nature. I didn't even really know until I was sent to boarding school in Vancouver when I was 14, how lucky I'd been and what a unique childhood I'd had, playing on the tide flats by the salmon spawning streams and in the woods and in the clearings. And I excelled in high school in science, and then at university as an undergrad, I did life science, biology, biochemistry, genetics, a little forestry, because that's the main industry in my province of British Columbia. And then I discovered ecology, a word that had not yet appeared in the popular press. It was a fairly obscure branch of biology to study the interrelationships among all the different factors in the environment, including the living and the non-living components. So all life plus the oceans and the land and the atmosphere all interacting together as a living planet. And I, even though I'd been brought up in an agnostic family and we didn't use the word spiritual much at the dinner table, when I discovered ecology, I realized that through science, which I had previously believed was a purely technical subject, that I could gain an insight into the mystery of the universe with the infinity of interrelationships that there are going on. And that actually was a grounding for much later, because at that time climate change wasn't even a slight issue. It was a grounding for getting into the climate change discussion, because the truth is the climate is possibly the most complex system on Earth. I don't think of anything else that is, because it's everything basically acting together, because the atmosphere, the oceans, the terrestrial environment, the minerals are all involved in the climate issue, as is the astrophysics side of it, the sun, and perhaps even the galactic side of it, the cosmic rays. So that led me to do a PhD in ecology. at the University of British Columbia. And while I was doing my PhD in 1971, I heard about this little group that was starting to meet in a church basement in Vancouver called the Don't Make a Wave Committee. They decided we were going to go across the Pacific Ocean in a boat and stop US hydrogen bomb testing. In other words, take on the world's most powerful organization and war machine.
Right.
And so I joined that group and became the ecologist on the first voyage of what became Greenpeace. It wasn't called Greenpeace then, but we named the boat the Greenpeace. And Greenpeace came about when one of the members of this little group, we were leaving our meeting and saying goodbye. And those days, quite often you said goodbye by just going peace. And he said, why don't we make it a Greenpeace? And that stuck. And it was really interesting because it was kind of a synthesis of the long-standing peace movement, civil disobedience, Socrates, etc., on down, and the newly emerging consciousness of the environment. So the peace part was for peaceful, nonviolent protest against things that are wrong going on in the world, and the green, of course, was for ecology. And I spent 15 years then, full time, after getting my PhD. I never left Greenpeace after that, except for a brief interlude when there wasn't much going on after the first campaign against US hydrogen bomb testing. Next, we took on French atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific. One of the most famous incidents occurred just before I left Greenpeace in 1985, when the French commandos, under orders from President Mitterrand, bombed and sank our boat in Auckland Harbor, killing our photographer. That was the Rainbow Warrior. And but we went on to save the whales. I was on all 4 Save the Whales voyages into the Pacific in the late 70s, mid to late 70s. And it took us 7 years to stop international whaling in international waters, but we did. We stopped the slaughter of 30,000 whales a year. And whereas with the H-bomb campaign, our first campaign, there were many other people and groups working on that. I think Greenpeace can almost single-handedly take credit for ending the international whaling industry, because we not only went out on the high seas and got in front of the harpoons and got that footage on TV for everybody to see around the world, we basically went into the International Whaling Commission, a UN agency, and recruited island states and other sympathetic countries into the IWC and got a majority to beat the Japanese and Russians. They were trying to buy people off all the time to side with them, but we beat them in 1979, and that ended Russian and Japanese whaling in the North Pacific. And by 1981, in all the world's oceans, except for a few whales that are still being killed by Japan in Antarctica, they just refuse to give it up, as if the Japanese whaling fleet will rise again someday. But I don't think that's going to happen. So that's sort of the story to the end of Greenpeace. I left in 1986. The reason I left Greenpeace was because we'd started with a very strong humanitarian orientation to stop nuclear war and destruction of civilization, that is people. And by the end of it, the peace part had sort of got forgotten, and all it was green. And even worse, even my fellow directors and many other members of the environmental movement basically adopted the opinion that humans are the enemies of the earth, almost as if we are separate from nature and not part of it. Like all we are is the bad guy, we're the devil, and all the other species are good. Like we're worse than smallpox or vermin or whatever. You know, that's the kind of attitude you see today in a lot of the environmental movement, and they're quite open about it. Many of them see that, you know, at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis, saw this as a way of thinning out the population or slowing down civilization or perhaps even stopping it. And some of their policies, you know, and the sharp end of the stick when I left Greenpeace after 8 years on the International Board of Directors, there was only 6 of us. And it was one thing, the overall general idea of being anti-human, which is not a specific policy in a way. my fellow directors, none of whom had any formal science education. I had human biochemistry and a whole bunch of other formal science in life science and genetics. And they decided that what Greenpeace should do, seeing as though dioxin and DDT and PCBs are all chlorinated hydrocarbons, that we should ban chlorine worldwide. And Greenpeace actually adopted a campaign in the mid-'80s to the late 80s to ban chlorine worldwide. And I said, you guys, not only is chlorine one of the elements in the periodic table, I mean, it's one of the building blocks of the universe. It's the 11th most common element in the Earth's crust. So banning chlorine is not on. You can't ban an element. But that was a bit of a joke. The real truth is chlorine is the most important of all the elements in the periodic table for public health and medicine. Adding chlorine to drinking water was the biggest advance in the history of public health, and the majority of our synthetic pharmaceuticals for curing us from diseases are made with chlorine chemistry. So I had to leave.
So fast forward then, and you're certainly skeptical now of the current projections through the Ipcc regarding what impact human activity has on climate change. So my first question is, how much is the world actually warming? I mean, is it something that is as rampant as what we've been told, or is it a much more gradual warming?
Since the possibility that human impact could have made a change, in other words, if you accept that carbon dioxide will cause a warming of the planet if it's increased in the atmosphere, it's been just a little over 1 degree Celsius. In other words, 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. It's minuscule. The climate has changed by 1 degree Celsius millions of times in the history of the Earth. It's not out of the ordinary. If you just go back only as far as the Roman warm period, which was 2,000 years ago, we've been going through 500-year cycles of warming and cooling and warming and cooling. And after the Roman warm period was the Dark Ages cold period. One of the reasons it was the Dark Ages is because it got cold and crops failed. And then the medieval warm period came on, which is around 1000 AD, when the Norse or Vikings colonized Greenland, where Greenland had more agricultural capability than it does today. Many people believe the Earth was warmer during the medieval warm period. We know almost for certain that it was warmer during the Roman warm period because the tree line in the Alps was higher, and that can be determined by pollen residues in mountain lakes as to how high that they can tell what species were growing at what altitude, all the way back to much longer than that. And so we know the Roman warm period was warmer. Then coming out of the medieval warm period, the temperature went down into the Little Ice Age, which is probably the coldest it's been in 10,000 years. As temperatures go up and down in cycles. Mm-hmm. And now we're in the modern warm period. It started in 1700, long before people started using fossil fuels at all. And even since 1850, when we started using fossil fuels in earnest, by 1900, we were only emitting about 6% of the CO2 we are today, and there has not been any great acceleration in the warming that began 300 years ago. So 1 degree of warming, but the two great ironies of this situation is they say CO2 is getting too high and temperature is getting too hot. In fact, we are in a period that has seen the lowest CO2 level in the atmosphere in the history of the Earth. And that was at the height of the last glaciation, 18 to 20,000 years ago, when it sank down to 180 parts per million, which is only 30 parts per million above the death of plants. Just like us, you need a certain percentage of oxygen in order to live. 2% oxygen in the atmosphere, we would die. At 20%, we're fine. And same with plants at 150 ppm, they start to die even though they were able to live at 180, they were starving to death. And coming out of the last glaciation, the oceans warmed and gave off CO2 to bring the atmosphere up to 280. And that's where we came in and have taken it now up to 415. And that has resulted in a greening of the Earth, which is now 30% more vegetation, biomass on this planet than there was in 1950 as a result of the beneficial effects of our CO2. Secondly, this is the coldest it's been in this Pleistocene ice age for 260 million years. It was warmer than this all the way until we were plunged into this ice age 5 million years ago. It started to freeze over the North Pole, and that isn't a very long time in history. So most of Earth's history, it's been warmer than it is today, and all of Earth's history, CO2 has been higher than it has been in this era.
I
so
know
they're
that,
totally wrong on both counts.
and I know I've had conversations with people in the past, and their thought was, and they're listening to what their elected officials will say, and they're listening to what the consensus of scientists are saying, and they're saying we have to reduce our CO2 output. We have to reduce our CO2. And that was always the question I asked them was, what number is the right number for you? Because to your point, what you just said there, we're now at 400. Anything below 150 and our lives are going to be catastrophically affected because plants are going to die out. So what is a point where we should be worried? I mean, what would be a point where, okay, our parts per million is getting a little high, we should be doing something about it?
Well, let's put it into perspective. 500 million years ago and back to about 550 million years ago was the Cambrian period, when the explosion of life occurred. The Cambrian explosion, it's called. Mm-hmm. It was when multicellular life evolved. Before that, all life for 3 billion years had been unicellular, microscopic, and confined to the sea and maybe the lakes, but not on the land. Life didn't actually come on the land until 440 million years ago. But 550 million years ago, when multicellular life evolved and there was this explosion of species types, CO2 was at 6,000 ppm. And by the end of the Cambrian, it had dropped down to about 4,000. So that is 10 to 15 times higher than it is today. And life did just fine in that environment. Then during the Carboniferous period, when trees were evolved, it fell down quite low, maybe as low as it is today or a little higher, and then back up again to 2,500 ppm 150 million years ago at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. And then, since then, it has fallen steady from 2,500 down to the lowest it's ever been in known history, 20,000 years ago at 180 ppm. So from 2,500 to 180. Now, okay, there's the history. Life is fine at anywhere between 180, although that was starvation for most plants,
right,
up to 6,000. So that it worked. That all of that worked. Life did not die out at any time during that 500 million year period. So you come to how do you get an idea about what the best plant for plants, because it's plants that need the CO2. We don't need the CO2, right, except that we need the plants. So we do need the CO2 so that we could be here, because animals couldn't exist if it weren't for photosynthetic plants. And so the commercial greenhouse growers are the best bellwether for how much CO2 would be good for plants, because what they do, all commercial greenhouse growers worldwide either buy bottled CO2 or buy CO2 generators, which use natural gas usually, or wood, to make CO2 by burning it. And they feed that into their greenhouses, and their standard level is between 800 and 1,200 parts per million. In other words, 2 to 3 times higher than it is now. And they get up to 60% increased yield from their plants, and people are working in the greenhouses all day long and all year long. Submariners have a maximum of 8,000 ppm. The Apollo 13, when it had the accident coming back from the moon, it probably went up to 30 or 40,000 ppm in there before they fixed it, and it didn't hurt them. And actually up to about 50,000 ppm, there is no real problem. And even then, it doesn't become toxic, even at higher levels, because what it is, it becomes an asphyxiant. It's sort of like drowning from water. Right. Water isn't a toxin, but it prevents you from getting oxygen. And that's the same thing that happens with CO2 when it gets up to really high levels. It prevents your lungs from accessing the oxygen that you're breathing in, and you basically suffocate. So, but that's never going to happen. we're never even going to get CO2 up to 800 to 1,000 very easily with the fact that there's not enough fossil fuels to do that if we burn them all. And so I think it is just fine that we are putting this CO2 into the atmosphere. We have restored a balance to a global carbon cycle that was way out of whack because the CO2 was disappearing. Where was it going? Some of it was going into fossil fuels, but by far the majority was going into what are known as carbonaceous rocks. Limestone, marble, and chalk are all of life origin. They weren't created in a volcano or deep into the bowels of the earth like granite or other rocks. These rocks were made from the shells of marine calcifying species like coral reefs. Imagine how much calcium carbonate is what limestone is, and that's what the shells of marine animals are made of. The carbon in the carbonate comes from CO2 in the ocean, which originally came from the atmosphere, from volcanoes into the atmosphere when the earth was much hotter in its first couple of billion years. And it's much cooler now because the heat of the inside of the earth is made from radiation, from radioactive decay of uranium, radon, and thorium and other radioactive compounds. And they have decreased tremendously in 4.5 billion years because they have half-lives where half of them decay in a period of, say, 800 million years, like uranium-238. And so it's been through 6 half-lives since the Earth was formed. So there's only about 1.5% of it left. And this is the true picture, is that most of the carbon dioxide in the global atmosphere has been turned into limestone, calcium carbonate, after 500 million years of marine species learning to control the crystallization of calcium carbonate as a protective shell around them, all the way from microscopic coccolithophores, which are a phytoplankton, a plant, to foraminifera, up to a huge coral reef. And there's many in between, all the mussels and clams and barnacles, everything that has a shell, that is made with carbon dioxide and calcium. And that's what's taken the carbon dioxide out of the global system. And we inadvertently, in the same way that the calcifiers inadvertently started taking CO2 down to levels that were dangerous for the survival of life, we inadvertently, by using fossil fuels and making cement, because cement is made from calcium carbonate from limestone, and that's about 5% of our CO2 emissions, which is a lot of emissions. The emissions from fossil fuels are nearly 95% of our emissions, and that's a really lot of emissions. But what it's done is it's restored a balance to the carbon cycle and is putting the CO2 back. You see, where do they think the carbon in the coal came from in the first place, and the carbon in the gasoline and in the natural gas? It came from plants and plankton, which were made by photosynthesis, by solar energy. The fossil fuels are organic. They're made with carbon. The chemistry of carbon is organic chemistry. So, and when you burn fossil fuels, they release water and CO2, which are the two things that plants use to make sugars through photosynthesis. So it's perfect recycling. And we need more CO2 in the atmosphere to increase the productivity of the green plant life on planet Earth. It's as simple as that. So,
okay, so then we've determined that we're not going to get to a point where the CO2 is going to be toxic. The CO2 is actually a benefit and beneficial to our life and to the photosynthesis process. But per the Ipcc, does it cause warming? Is it causing the warming that will eventually melt the glaciers in the Arctic and the Antarctic, will eventually rise the sea levels and flood coastlines? Is there a correlation between that rise in the CO2 and a rise in heat?
That's a hypothesis, but there's many reasons to believe that that is not a cause-effect situation. Like I think it was 4 major glaciations ago, when CO2 was at 280 ppm, like it was before the industrial era, the sea level was 9 meters higher than it is today. So the CO2 was much lower than it is today, and the sea level was much higher. What people don't understand is the sea level has fluctuated over 800 feet during some of these periods of change from glaciation to non-glaciation. What I want to know is why they want us to stay in an ice age, which is what we're in. We're in the Pleistocene ice age, and people make the mistake, and I think sometimes people on purpose help them make the mistake, that the last glacial maximum was the ice age. No, there have been 40 or 45 glacial maximums during the Pleistocene ice age. That was just the most recent one. And the Vostok ice cores, which were drilled in Antarctica by the Russians, and then the European ice cores drilled even deeper, they go back 800,000 years. So 8 cycles, because the glacial cycles are on 100,000-year periods. The Vostok ice core showed very clearly that the Eemian interglacial period, which is similar to our Holocene interglacial period, it was the one before this, was warmer than this one is. And the cold periods are getting colder. We may actually still be plunging into a colder period in regard to the long-term ice age called the Pleistocene. We don't know the answer to that. But the idea that the ice age is over is wrong. We have no reason to believe that the ice age is over just because we're in an interglacial period.
Is this an overreaction in terms of, we're looking at a very small, historically, if you're looking at all of time, we're looking at a very small window of time, and then trying to project that this is going to have an enormous impact on our lives. Should we be looking at a much larger data set in terms of, you know, you're mentioning a lot of periods of our evolution, thousands and thousands of years ago, but all we're focusing on in terms of the current discussion is the last 100 years, the last 50 years, our temperature has just skyrocketed, and we in 12 years, we're all going to be underwater and millions are going to die. Should we be looking at a longer term forecast to make those decisions?
Well, first, those apocalyptic forecasts are garbage. There's no possibility that the Earth is coming to an end in 12 years, or that half the species will go extinct, you know, by 2050.
Right.
And that the human population there will be 50 billion climate refugees. The only climate refugees there are all the people in Canada who go to Florida in the winter because it's warmer there. Right? Those, we call them snowbirds, but they are in fact climate refugees. Because if you want to live on the prairies at 30 below all winter, when you don't have much to do on the farm, why wouldn't you go to Florida? You know, it's so backwards. You know, I often open my presentation by saying, Canada, my country, is the coldest country in the world of all 195 countries at minus 5.35 Celsius average temperature, colder than Russia by a tiny bit, because we have these islands that go all the way up nearly to the North Pole, and Russia doesn't. They have a big sea north of them. So even though it's colder in some parts of Russia than it ever gets in anywhere in Canada, the average temperature of Canada is colder than Russia. And yet Canadians are nuts about climate change. They're scared to death of it. And the Prime Minister is putting in carbon taxes and gets reelected for doing so. Meanwhile, the people in China, India, Bangladesh, Brazil, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, do you think they're worried about climate change and global warming? No, they like it warm. They're not worried about warm. It's really nice there most of the time. I mean, it's a good thing you have air conditioning in Saudi Arabia, because it was not the most enjoyable place in the heat of the day. But it's an extreme situation, just like Canada is. But they are not like all nutso about global warming like people in North America, Europe, Australia, New Zealand are. Even the Japanese are pretty lukewarm on it, and the Russians reject it completely because they simply do not believe it. They believe the sun has far more impact in climate change than we do. As a matter of fact, our main impact on the Earth has been the conversion of areas to agricultural land, large areas. And that has changed microclimates. It might not have changed the global climate, but it's changed a lot of landscapes and climates.
Let me ask you this also. You just mentioned changing the environment, which could potentially change the global temperature. Do you have any problem with the measurement methods that we're using in terms of gauging that it has gone up 1.8 degrees Celsius over the last X number of years? And I ask that just because of, the thermometers that they're putting in place. If they're not being moved or they're not being readjusted, depending just for the urban sprawl, wouldn't you have the potential that something that might have been placed in a field 30 years ago is now in a parking lot, and the heat signatures coming from a parking lot to a field are significantly different, right? I don't know. Do you have any issues with the measurement methods?
A number of points, yes. The urban heat island effect is one of the key ones, as you mentioned there, where grassland turns into concrete.
Right.
And that makes it warmer. It could be 2 to 3 degrees warmer. And that was first pointed out by Anthony Watts of the blog What's Up With That, which is the most looked at climate blog on the internet. And it's a skeptic blog with a lot of scientists contributing to it, including myself at times. The other thing is the blatant manipulation of the data.
Yes.
They have words like homogenization. They're homogenizing the data. Like, what does that mean? They take the number that was recorded at the time and they change it because they have a theory about why it wasn't what it says it was. And for some reason, it always tends to lower the temperatures back in history and increase the temperatures closer to now, making the curve steeper, in other words. So that has happened. I don't trust much of it. And one of the big problems, I'm writing a book right now titled Invisible Catastrophes and Threats of Doom. And trying to get out of Google any kind of balance on some of these issues, like everybody who really understands the greenhouse gas effect and greenhouse gases knows that water vapor is by far the most important greenhouse gas. It's up to maybe even 90% of the greenhouse effect. Carbon dioxide is a far behind second effect, and then methane third, way back, really having no significant effect. Mm-hmm. But they're trying to make a big deal out of it because natural gas is methane, and now they're attacking the fossil fuel through the climate change story and making a narrative that methane is somehow causing it to warm too. I wouldn't be surprised if water vapor almost basically negates the global warming effect of CO2, or this gets really complicated, and that's why they say, well, it's simple physics. Yeah. No, it's not simple physics. There is no such thing as simple physics. Physics is really complicated and often not even slightly intuitive. And so that's what they're claiming, is that it is simple physics, but they say that when CO2 goes up and makes the temperature warmer, that will make water vapor go up and have a knock-on effect, what's called a positive feedback. And that knock-on effect will result in 3 times the warming that CO2 would by itself. Well, sure, if the temperature gets warmer, more water will evaporate into the atmosphere, but it may end up being clouds rather than water vapor, and clouds keep sunlight out. So it actually may be a negative feedback to, the thing is, the historical record does not support the idea that CO2 controls the global temperature, not even slightly. CO2 and temperature are so out of sync, going in opposite directions in one case for 130 million years. Well, temperature went up, CO2 went down, then temperature went down and CO2 went up. How can that happen if it's a cause-effect relationship for 130 million years? Now they're saying nothing that happened before 1850 really matters. All that matters is that from 1850 to now, it's been warming and CO2 has been going up. Well, it was already warming before we started putting CO2 into the atmosphere, and it has not materially accelerated since. They're telling us now that sea level rise is accelerating, and they're doing that by sticking the new satellite measurements on top of the tide gauge measurements. And it's true, the satellites are indicating a faster rate of sea level rise than tide gauges. But you tell me what's more accurate than a tide gauge that's been in the same place and being recorded now electronically 24 hours a day. Nothing is more accurate than that. It's a direct measurement of the level of the sea. And anyways, who cares what the sea level is out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean? Unless you're on an island, and then you care. All you care about is the sea level at the shore, right?
Right.
And not many people understand that where the glaciers were during the last glaciation and the ones before, but especially the last one, the glaciers in some cases were 1 mile to 3 miles deep of ice. This depressed the land. The land in Canada and Norway and Alaska is still rising from the weight of those glaciers being taken off 10,000 years ago. It's still rising. It's called isostatic rebound or post-glacial rebound. And where I live on Vancouver Island, which had glaciers 1 mile high, the sea is falling here. It's actually receding because the land is rising faster than the sea is. It's not as if the sea level isn't rising around the world. It is, but it's that too is part because of the modern warm period. When going into the little ice age, the sea level went down. The sea level has been pretty well within a few meters of the same level for the last 8,000 years since all the major glaciers melted. Most of the glaciers that are with us now are melting and returning, melting and returning as we go through these warmer and colder periods. So it's very frustrating that they get away, especially it's tiresome that we are lectured by teenagers on this.
Yeah. On
such a complicated subject. And non-scientists like Al Gore, Leonardo DiCaprio, and these people, they pretend that they know, have some kind of crystal ball. And of course, they're relying on the 97% of climate scientists who have a consensus on this. Right?
And that's what I want to get to, if I could. The first thing I want to ask is, what is the goal of trying to limit CO2 and limit fossil fuels? And usually I think, okay, you follow the money, there's money to be made in not doing that. But there's an incredible amount of money to be made by using oil and having fossil fuels. So it seems, what is the goal of the IPCC to blame it all on CO2, blame it all on fossil fuels? What are they trying to get out of that? It seems to me like it's a political stance, 100%. They're trying to somehow change public policy through fear, but what's their ultimate goal?
Well, first, it's important to recognize they call themselves a scientific organization, but the IPCC is purely a political body. It's an arm of the United Nations. They hire scientists to work for them. They are not a science body. So they have political motives, and their mandate automatically skews them to support the apocalyptic narrative because they are only mandated to study human effects on the climate. They are not a full climate change organization. They're not studying other effects on the climate to anywhere near the extent they're focusing on human emissions. And they are also a partnership. The two UN organizations that form the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are the World Meteorological Organization, in other words, weather people, and the United Nations Environment Program. The weather people are more grounded in science. They look at maps of isobars and they try to predict the weather for a week or two by knowing how these different systems work. But the United Nations Environment Program is extremely political. It is basically an arm of the environmental movement. And most of these UN agencies are run by globalists who believe in one world government. I'm not sure if it's bureaucrats in Beijing or what is going to be when we get that, but I'm not for that. I believe that the existing nation state system is the only way we can keep peace in the world, and in particular, democracy. But a lot of people these days are pandering to China, like as if they have a better system of government. So that's a big divide. Yeah. This whole thing with World Health Organization and this Ethiopian guy that appears to be in the pocket of the Chinese communist regime and all of that. Now, I don't talk about politics most of the time, but you can't help but notice, eh?
Right. Well, and again, to your point, the IPCC seems so political. And you talked about this 97% consensus. And I remember President Obama here talking about, this is settled science. 97% of science of climate scientists agree that we are the problem. Why is that do you agree with that statement? I mean, obviously settled science, 97% consensus. What does that really mean? So to your, like Leonardo DiCaprio, all he hears is 97% of climate scientists believe that we are the cause of global warming, but he's not told the whole truth. What does that really mean?
Well, there's 2 points to that.
Yeah.
First off, even if there was a 97% consensus, that in itself proves nothing. If you go back in history to the people, the individuals who made the most important discoveries in science, Galileo in astronomy, Mendel in genetics, Darwin in evolution, Einstein in physics, and there's many more, they all had to fight a wrong consensus with their ideas, some of them even to their death. Some of them were threatened with death, like Galileo, for suggesting that the sun was in the center of the solar system and the earth wasn't in the center of the universe. So consensus in itself has absolutely no merit in science. Michael Crichton put it this way: if it's consensus, it isn't science. If it's science, it isn't consensus. Consensus is not a science word. It is a political and social word, a socio-political word. It has to do with making decisions about policies and rules of law and things like that, with making decisions. Science isn't about making decisions. Science is about getting to the bottom of things and figuring out the cause and effect. In other words, science is about facts, and facts have nothing to do with consensus whatsoever. The second point is the 97% is totally false. It only appears that way because that's all the fake news covers.
Right.
But they don't cover the other side. And some of them, the LA Times was one of the first that just said explicitly, we are not going to give any ink to these skeptics anymore because we believe the climate scientists. And there, climate scientist means all of us who believe this. If you're not a climate scientist, you're a climate denier. Climate denier is the opposite of climate scientist. So skeptics are automatically not climate scientists, even if they are scientists like me and Will Happer and Richard Linson and the late Freeman Dyson, all of whom are top physicists. I'm an ecologist, but I understand systems. And so we're not climate scientists. Yet many of these so-called climate scientists, their degrees aren't in climate, they're in physics or math or some other area, but they are allowed to call themselves climate scientists because they're believers. And so what has happened here is the climate change movement has become something of a toxic combination of a religious cult and far left political ideology all rolled up into a real ugly thing. And what they are trying to do is basically, if you believe that they really do think that all fossil fuels should be eliminated and we should go to net zero, then their ambition is to completely and utterly destroy civilization. Because you cannot feed 8 billion people without fossil fuels. You simply can't. Unless, of course, they would agree to nuclear energy. We could easily replace 50% of the fossil fuels with nuclear energy, and I'll explain quickly how.
Sure.
First, almost all the electricity could be made with nuclear energy, right? That is about 1/3 of all energy use. And then that and would be more now, because now that electricity will be used for heating and cooling all structures, which is about 35% of global energy use. So now we don't need oil or gas for heating. We just need it for peaking power, because and actually they'll be making nuclear plants that can go up and down in their power outage, and then you can handle peaking with nuclear. So that's the first big thing. The second thing is all large ships could be nuclear. The Russian icebreaker fleet is totally nuclear in the Arctic, going through 8 feet of ice. The submarines in the 6 nuclear navies are nuclear. So are the aircraft carriers in most of the big countries' navies. They're nuclear powered. So every oil tanker, every freighter, every cruise ship could be nuclear powered. But isn't it interesting? Then Greens are against nuclear energy, even though statistically it is the safest of all electricity generating technologies based on casualties versus power output per unit of power output. So there's no reason to be against nuclear from a safety point of view. And so what's your reason for being against nuclear? Nobody died in Fukushima. CNN had a headline during Fukushima: nuclear crisis deepens as bodies wash ashore. They actually did that in the middle of the crisis. The bodies were washing ashore because of the tsunami, not because of the nuclear accident. The nuclear accident itself was caused by a tsunami and very bad planning on the Japanese part, both before, during, and after the accident. But that's another story. That all could have been avoided very easily. But so Chernobyl turns out to be the only nuclear reactor that has caused death to civilians. That was 86 people. And that was a really stupid reactor design, and they since have stopped making them.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit on the part of the problem is the media as well. And the media pushes an agenda that they want to push. And the majority of people have been brought up from childhood to believe what they see on the news, believe what they read on Google, on the news outlets, and they don't think that those places have their own agenda and their own bias as well, or they're pushing a particular angle of the story. And it is interesting to me that you were talking about nuclear. That, to me, I agree with you. That seems to be a much cleaner, easier, more effective method of powering than trying to go solar or trying to go wind power that won't really give us what we need. And it takes up enormous, trying to do a solar power array or whatever, that would take up an enormous amount of land that we could be using for other things. And it wouldn't get us even close to the energy we need. But I never understood why they were so resistant to going nuclear, and they were always pushing wind and solar. I didn't know. So to me, so you're saying it's really kind of just a political thing. The Ipcc is pushing an agenda for what? I mean, who gets rich on going solar and wind power?
Millions of people. It's crony capitalism, rent-seeking people, because wind and solar have three cash flow things that are not based on market. That's subsidies, direct subsidies, guaranteed prices, mandates for utilities to have to buy them. And the utilities are sucked into this too, even though they should be the ones who care about producing cost-effective, reliable power, because when they go solar and wind with all these big batteries that are going to cost a fortune, they actually make more money doing that. So they're all in it together, in cahoots. And the truth is, wind and solar are a parasite on the larger economy. Mm-hmm. They do not produce enough energy to justify their existence if you take all the mining. So what I've said, like, do you think they're using solar power to run the giant machines digging the stuff out of the ground to make the solar panels and wind machines with? No. That's what I say, is that solar and wind should prove themselves by showing that they can build their own infrastructure with their own energy. But they can't. Those wind and solar machines are built with fossil fuel energy and nuclear energy and hydroelectric energy, and they are just ornaments. Not only that, wind turbines in the United States kill over 80,000 predator birds a year and over 12 million total birds. It's just ridiculous. President Obama passed a law saying that wind turbines can kill all the birds they want, where other people who kill birds have to pay fines, especially raptors, the predator birds like eagles and hawks, and that sort of thing. It kills. There's actually the U.S. Wildlife Service has a bird morgue where the birds are put in plastic bags and hung on a rope and frozen. That's their bird morgue. There's pictures of it. I've got the pictures of it. And it's disgusting what they are doing. And they act now as if the desert is just something you can just tear down all the plants and yuccas and everything and put in a solar farm because there's nothing in the desert. Wrong. Deserts are extremely biodiverse. I happen to have a place in Mexico in a semi-desert. It's a wonderful place to be. It's so much life. And it's not lush like a rainforest, but it's still full of tremendous amount of biodiversity. And I just think it's a tragedy what's happened here with the wind and solar business. You see, the climate change movement itself and all the scientists who are doing all this research and saying, oh, the science is settled, but I still need another grant to do some more study on it. You know, serial climate change grants every year. Why, if it's settled, why do you have to study it some more? You know, and there's hundreds of millions going that way, but there's billions and even trillions going the way of the technologies that this narrative is supporting. So there's where the real money is in the wind and solar and other technologies that get subsidies for replacing fossil fuels. It just won't happen, is the truth of the matter.
So
I say they will rust in place as a take on rest in peace.
Yeah.
The windmills and solar panels.
So I have just a few more questions.
Negative force.
We're coming up to the end of the time. I have two more questions for you. And one would be, so it sounds to me like, what would be the thing that you would put your money on right now? You know, they're talking about they're proposing this Green New Deal here in the United States, and it's just a terrible, terrible bill, spending a lot of money on what we just talked about, wind farms and solar farms. Is there some place that we should be putting our money? Is there something that we should be working on right now? I know you had mentioned nuclear. Should we be doing more towards that? And then kind of secondarily, everybody is so worried. Should we be afraid? It's kind of your last word. Should we be scared? What should we be scared of? Other than the politicians that we have at this point, what else is there? Is there something in the climate that we really should be worried about? And what can we do about that?
Well, the one thing good about this pandemic of COVID-19 is it showed us what a real crisis is.
Yeah.
I think there's been an overreaction. Well, I know there's been an overreaction because they were predicting 10 times as many cases and casualties at the beginning, and that would have been more like the Spanish flu. It's nothing like that. It's more like a bad influenza year is what it's like if you look at the numbers. And nobody ever got into a panic and locked down because there was influenza raging through the population. It's just that it's seasonal flu. But many people die from it because of pneumonia. This apparently doesn't cause pneumonia, but it causes a clotting of the blood. It's what's called thrombosis in your lungs. And it kills, especially, like 80% of the people who've died from it are over 60. And a very, very small percentage are under 20. So it has, at least there's that. But I'm sure, I saw them try to link the coronavirus with climate change. See, that's what they do.
Yeah.
They just make stuff up, like, hey, viruses go away in the summer. That's because it's warmer then. You guys can't even think that into the situation. You make a stupid correlation that you say that the warming of the world is going to make the coronavirus worse. No, it's going to fry it, make it go away. And you see the curve in the UK has come right back down to just where it started after a huge peak. And this is going to happen all over the world. But now everybody's worried about other things and fear. I believe in some ways you can blame climate change for the coronavirus in the fear campaign aspect.
Absolutely.
Not the fact that climate change makes the coronavirus worse. It makes the fear worse in the coronavirus fear, because people have been geared to fear all last year about the climate issue. And now this comes along and that fear is triggered even further. And fear and guilt are two of the biggest motivators. You're driving down the highway in your SUV, you're afraid you're killing your grandchildren, and that makes you feel guilty. So you send a check to Greenpeace. Like I started in Greenpeace, we were all volunteers. We had a noble cause. We cared about people and the environment. And over the years, gradually with the great success we had, suddenly we had a payroll to meet and fundraising came to the top of the agenda. Instead of just volunteering, we started paying ourselves a salary because you got to eat, pay the rent.
Right.
So pretty soon fundraising becomes really important and you become a business more or less. And then not too long after that, the business becomes a racket. And that is how a lot of organizations go. I would say that Oxfam is a classic example of that kind of evolution over time. Corruption comes in. In our case, in Greenpeace, the radical left hijacked Greenpeace because they saw that it had power and the ability to raise money. And people like myself, a meek biologist, ecologist, cannot match the sort of, I don't know, it's like anger and greed combined that the left brings to these discussions.
Right.
And also shunning and division and race politics and all that sort of stuff. That's what happened to Greenpeace. It got taken over. We were fairly balanced in the beginning. There were lots of lefties in the environmental movement right from the start, but there were also lots of people like in the Sierra Club and more established groups who were not extreme leftist. And that is all changed long ago and part of why I had to leave and be a sensible environmentalist.
Are we too far gone now? Are we too far gone as a society to have some people step up and say, we don't agree with what the Ipcc is saying. We have proffered a different opinion. Are we too far gone for that? To your point, we are conditioned to fear. And I agree with you 100% that this lockdown and this incredible knee-jerk reaction to corona is impacted by the fact that we have been conditioned to fear. So we've locked ourselves down without really any indication without the appropriate information first. We didn't wait for the information to actually come in. We simply shut everything down. And then when the information came in, then it's too late. We've been home for 2 months. Businesses have been closed for 2 months. The economy has been just completely destroyed for just the promise of something bad, not the actual reality. Is it too late for us to be able to stand up and say, we don't agree with this climate change predictions? We have our own, whether it be the ozone layer, back in the late 70s, early 80s, it was the ozone. When I was growing up, it was the ozone layer. That was what was causing global warming. That was what was causing climate change. We had to get rid of the aerosols, and we did that. I mean, is it too late for us?
No, it's never too late, Pete, but I do despair to some extent for the ignorance that is being spread around the world. It's very unsatisfactory to see science basically sinking to this dismal low it's at now, where they're talking about consensus as if it's science, and they're saying it's too hot when actually it's one of the coldest periods in history. They're saying there's too much CO2 when it's lower than it's been in most of the history of the world. And there's no evidence that more CO2 would be harmful. There's much evidence that sea level rise started long before any CO2 was put in the air by humans, and all these other points. And they are religiously convicted. I mean, it's like they're being led off a cliff like a bunch of lemmings. And there's a lot of money in it, and it won't be easy to stop, because if you think about it, it's a powerful convergence of interests among the green movement, the media, leftist politicians, and some right politicians, the green business, the crony capitalists. When General Electric builds a wind farm, it gets to write off the expense of doing that against its fossil fuel turbines for jet aircraft, and all kinds of shenanigans like that. And then there's the scientists who are taking the money from government. One of the worst things that happened in the history of science is it became dependent on public money. It used to be that science was run by DuPont and GM and 3M and Chrysler and whoever, right? That they were doing the science. And usually they were hoping something useful came from it. What's coming from the climate change industry? Fear. That's what's coming from it. And a lot of wasted money. So it's a terrible result, but it has a very powerful allegiance of all of the globalists and all of those categories I mentioned. You can throw Hollywood in there as being separate from media in some senses, but if anything is going to destroy our culture, it's going to be the social media, the fake media, the scare being spread amongst our children, the propaganda of media. I'm not sure that the collective consciousness is capable of adjusting to this technological revolution. And just one more thought.
Sure.
Technology and mechanization have had some wonderful results. Most importantly, much less toil and drudgery. It used to be that about 80% of the population had to be growing food in the fields without machines, and the other 20% lived in the castle with the prince.
Right.
And since mechanization, now it takes less than 5% of the people to grow the food, and a big majority of the people are now in urban environments, and very few people are required to do the resource industries out in the hinterland. This means that the vast majority of urbanites living in a totally artificial environment are easy prey for the green movement to say, it's those guys out there chopping and digging and plowing and drilling that are the enemies of the earth. They are destroying the earth with what they're doing. When in fact, the only reason they're doing it is so the city people, who are 90% of the people, can have their concrete and steel and wood and food and energy to run their city. Because you can't grow your food on the 30th floor of a high-rise very easily. And so if they get away with this banning of fossil fuels, gradually cutting down on fossil fuels, they don't seem to understand that large machinery like tractors and hydraulic backhoes and all the huge machines and all the trucks carrying 50,000 pounds of food into the center of the city. So if agriculture fails, it will be the people in the centers of the cities that will go first, because the people on the outskirts of the city will hijack the trucks, because now they don't have enough food for the whole city anymore, and the people on the farms can't grow enough food anymore.
Right.
And that will be a total collapse of our civilization if they get away with this Green New Deal. And the fact that so many urban people support the Green New Deal is testament to my concern that the fake news social media could be the downfall of human civilization.
Well, it's amazing to me that otherwise incredibly intelligent, learned, educated people are just kind of buying it hook, line, and sinker, and they're not asking that next logical question. To me, everything is about asking the next logical question. You're given a line. Okay, what's the first question that comes to your mind? You ask that question. You get the answer. You ask the next question, versus saying, you know what's best for me. I'm just going to shut up and do what I'm told. I've never been that kind of guy, and I can't understand those kind of that kind of thought process. But thank you so much, Dr. Moore, for joining the show today. It has given me, and I'm sure it'll give the listeners a lot to think about. Would you like to spend just another moment and let the listeners out there know how to find out more information? I know your website is ecosense.me. But are you working on another? You said you're working on another book. I don't know if you have any.
Yes.
Probably don't have any.
First,
go ahead.
I'll give my Twitter. My Twitter address is @EcoSenseNow, so you can find me there. You can just go to Patrick Moore, ecologist, PhD, or whatever, Green Spirit, Greenpeace, and you can find my Twitter handle. That's where I'm most active in communicating. I find it a very useful tool to talk to people, and I have 106,000 followers, and it's growing nicely. Yeah. And it's like having 106,000 students and another 1,000 of them who are actually people you learn from yourself. So it's great. The book I'm writing, the book that's available at Amazon, is Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, The Making of a Sensible Environmentalist. It's under $10 for the ebook. The paperback's fairly expensive because it's got lots of illustrations and it's 480 pages or something. But it's worth a read. And if you read my book and that book and read every footnote in it, you would know more about the environment than 99% of the people on the planet do. This next book is a revelation of mine that nearly all the scare stories that are made up for the public to be afraid of are about things that are either invisible or so remote that no one can check out for themselves if it's true. And observation is the basis of science. It's the beginning point of science. When you see something happen and you go, oh, it looks like this caused that. And you can't do that with polar bears. Even though the polar bears are visible, they are remote. And it's an invisible thing, carbon dioxide, which is threatening them, supposedly. Coral reefs are the same. Climate change itself is the same. You can't point over into the corner and say, look what that CO2 is doing over there, or up in the clouds, or anywhere. You can't see it. So how can you verify that these people are telling you the truth? So it ends up being that the public relies on Greens, the media, and scientists and politicians for the truth. And they can make up any story they want about CO2. And you can't tell whether they're telling the truth or not because you can't see it. So, like one of my favorites is the oldest baobab trees in Africa are dying at an unprecedented rate, and climate change may be the cause. Well, my first rule of critical thinking is never believe any lead sentence or headline that has the words may, might, or could in it.
Right.
Because it should say climate change may or may not be the cause, right? Because saying may, though, makes it seem like it's probable or something to people. And so that's a trick word. But that's what they say. It turns out that the only fact there was for that story that went headlines all around the world is a Romanian chemist who, for some reason, is the expert on baobab unprecedented deaths, was quoted as saying that 8 of the 13 oldest baobab trees have died in the last decade. That's less than 1 per year, 8 in 10 years, right? Of the oldest baobab trees. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of baobab trees. And what's so odd about the oldest ones dying? Isn't that perfectly normal? What if there was a headline saying the oldest Chinese are dying, right? That's who's supposed to die.
Yeah, typically, yeah.
And trees die too.
Yeah, typically the oldest of something is the one that dies. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, and you see it constantly. And now it's COVID. Now it's Corona.
No way can anybody. Yeah, it's invisible too.
Right. Now it's Corona. Now a person has a heart attack and dies of Corona. It's the same idea. It's the same fear. It's the same. They're trying to get you to click on the story. It's all clickbait. If they throw one of those hot buttons in, those keywords in, you'll read the story. It'll have nothing to do with Corona or global warming, but it got you to read the story. That's all they really care about.
Yeah, those guys, I hate them. They got me with the IQs. You'll be shocked at the IQs of Melania Trump and Michelle Obama.
Right.
And I did click on it, and it came up with something that was going to be like I was going to have to watch a slideshow 100 slides long to find the answer, probably. Yeah. So I just said, bag it. I don't want to know the difference between their IQ anyways. Yeah. But clickbait is really quite something. It's maddening. And that's one of the things that'll be the downfall of human civilization. Everybody's on clickbait. That in social media in general. Social media is the best and the worst all at the same time. It makes our lives better, and it is destroying us at the same time. It's super weird. It's like fast food. Fast food tastes great. It's killing you. You're eating these things that are just terrible for you. But that's another show. So thank you so much again, Dr. Moore. I really appreciate you joining us tonight. Again, that's ecosense.me. At Ecosense Now is the Twitter handle, and it is Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout is the name of the book. So once again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and stay well. Hopefully we'll talk to you again soon. It's fun talking to you, Pete. Thank you. So, okay. So once again, that was Dr. Patrick Moore. He is one of the preeminent guys. He is one of the top guys in terms of the climate change debate, and has an alternate view of what the Ipcc and the 97% consensus is saying. And he's not the first person I've had on the show that does not agree with the 97% consensus. The simple fact is there's never been any
correlation in terms of actual scientific studies that have proven that CO2 and heat are correlated. It has never been shown, but it is something that's being pushed over and over and over again. And we're being told we have to totally limit and eliminate all of our CO2 usage, all of our fossil fuel usage, or we're going to be underwater in the next 12 years. Well, I got news for you, folks. If you look through history at just millions of ancient civilizations, maybe not millions, hundreds of ancient civilizations, if you go right off the shore, you'll find all kinds of sunken cities. It's been that way forever. The water levels ebb and flow. They rise and they fall. And where do we put our cities? We put our cities on the edge of the water because it's an easy way to transport. So as the oceans rise, those cities will be swamped. As the oceans recede, we will move back farther down along the shoreline and we'll build something else. It is the way it has been forever. If you just do an easy Google search, you'll find all kinds of submerged ancient cities. So the fact that our water level may have gone up, 3 inches or 2 inches in the last 50 years is not a cause for alarm at this point. And to think that, they pose it as in 12 years, this enormous wave of water is going to come and to completely wipe out Miami and there's going to be millions of people dying. It's not going to happen like that. You're going to have a gradual increase in the oceans if it happens. People can walk away from it. They can just literally walk away from the rising tide. There may be a point in history where you have to abandon some of these cities that are right on the coastline because the coastline will be different. It may happen. I think that we have to come to grips with that. Or you may be like New Orleans. New Orleans built levees and kind of kept it at bay and hold it out. And New Orleans shouldn't be there. It's under the waterline right now. But we're humans. We find a way to engineer our environments in a way that supports us. So we'll probably keep doing that. But I think it is interesting to at least have the differing viewpoint, have somebody else who has credentials. This is not just the raving of a madman. He has credential. He has experience. He has history. He has a right to be able to say that I don't agree with the 97% quote unquote consensus. I don't agree that CO2 is this negative factor in our lives. And in reality, we need it. We need it badly. If it goes down below 150, we're all going to die. We're all going to die. That's when you should really be worried. Once plants start dying, we start dying. If it goes up, like we talked about tonight, it can go up to a point 800, 900, 1,000, 1,200 parts per million. We still won't see any impact. And if there's no correlation between that rise in the CO2 and the rise in heat, who cares? Who cares if it goes up? It actually will green up the planet. And a greening of the planet also would promote additional animal life. Animals eat the plants. We eat the animals. It's all the circle of life, folks. What are your thoughts? Do you agree with the Ipcc? I mean, again, to his point, there's been a lot of consensus throughout history. At one point, there was consensus that the earth was flat. At one point, it was consensus that smoking didn't harm you. There were a lot of consensuses that have been proven wrong throughout history. And this may be one of them. But this has a much bigger political backing, much more fear backing. The media is backing it. Money is backing it. And we have gotten to a point in our society where we believe the things we see online. It is what it is. There is no independent research or fact-checking going on. We're believing what we see, and we're overreacting to it in a lot of cases. What are your thoughts on it? Do you believe that this is overblown? Or do you believe it's real? Do you believe we have 10, 12 years left and then we're going to be underwater? I don't know. Those are all your opinions. I welcome all of those opinions. You can send them to me, provemewrongcast@gmail.com. That's our email address. You can also send me a line on Facebook or Instagram. It's just Prove Me Wrong. That's the name of the program. If you just want to find the podcast itself, we're on Spotify, TuneIn, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iTunes, any platform that you find podcasts, you can find the Prove Me Wrong podcast. Like and subscribe to the channel, and you will receive a notification when a brand new episode like this one is released. We release a new episode every week. So every week we'll have interesting conversations with interesting people who may have dissenting opinions on something else that you think is a consensus. So again, provemewrongcast@gmail.com, or you can find us on Facebook or Instagram or any of your podcast apps. Before we take off tonight, this episode of the Prove Me Wrong podcast is brought to you by Java Remix. Java Remix is a perfect blend of 100% organic Arabica coffee. It's infused with nano-emulsified CBD. You can start your day off on the right foot with a great tasting cup of coffee with all the demonstrated benefits of pure CBD. Java Remix offers traditional ground coffee, as well as single-serve K-Cups in both regular and decaf. And if you aren't a coffee person, Java Remix also offers CBD-infused teas and even beauty products like bath bombs and body scrubs. As an additional benefit to our Prove Me Wrong listeners, if you go online right now, javaremix.com, and enter the promo code Prove Me Wrong, you'll get an additional 20% discount off your entire shopping experience. Java Remix also offers free shipping on all orders over $40, so you have no reason not to give it a shot. Once again, that's javaremix.com, promo code Prove Me Wrong. The Prove Me Wrong podcast is brought to you tonight by ZendoZones citronella burners from JT Eaton. They are shaped like fearless little bug-repellent tiki gods. So let Surf and Stan, Hawaiian Howie, and Luau Lily bring the islands to your backyard with ZendoZones citronella burners. ZendoZones uses natural 3% citronella candles and incense cones. They're perfect for patios, decks, backyards, campsites, poolside, and more. You can enjoy the outdoors again. They are available on Amazon.com and at select Ace Hardware stores. Go ahead and collect them all today. So once again, Dr. Patrick Moore, legend in the climate change arena, doesn't agree with the Ipcc. I'm Pete Liebe. This is the Prove Me Wrong podcast, and we'll see you again soon.